This past Sunday, we finished looking at Ephesians chapter 1, and we were talking about how sometimes it can be difficult to understand how God's great, immeasurable power is working on our behalf. Difficult because we look at the evidence or the circumstances maybe in our own personal lives or in the broader world around us, and we say, boy, it sure doesn't feel as if God is working his power on our behalf. And we said that what Paul does to demonstrate that God is in fact working on our behalf with his great power, the primary evidence for that is to look at God the Father's relationship with Jesus Christ the Son. And Paul says that we can see God's power in the resurrection, in the exaltation, in the reign of Jesus Christ. But he finishes at the end of Ephesians chapter 1 by saying we also see the work of Jesus Christ in Jesus' headship over the church, which is his body that he fills. And we said that this was particularly meaningful this past Sunday when we met for the first time since March 8th in this building for corporate worship. And I want to be clear again that there are many reasons why some might choose, quite appropriately, not to come and worship with us physically in person at this particular moment. We respect the health concerns of people in the midst of a pandemic and communicable disease, and we want people to rightly take care of themselves and to take care of others that have been entrusted to them. And we're grateful for the technology of video that allows people to stay connected to some degree with what's going on here in this building. But make no mistake about it, we were meant to gather together physically with one another as a corporate representation of what God has done in drawing us into the church. And I told you that there was a story that I didn't have time to tell about the French Huguenots that was, I think, a great example of how God works his power on behalf of his church. The French Huguenots were Protestant reformers, people who had rediscovered the truth of what the Bible says of how we get into right relationship with God. They had come to this understanding in largely institutionally Catholic France, and they were persecuted for it. And it became so serious that the Protestant church, the Protestant Huguenots, as they were referred to, were forced to either flee the country or stay and go underground as a church. And make no mistake about it, there was danger in both directions, because it was against the law to leave as a religious refugee, and it was against the law to stay and practice your faith and worship corporately and publicly. And yet there's an example of God's faithfulness and God's power in both those who left and in those who stayed. For those who stayed, it's easy to understand why or how they might just kind of worship privately in their own homes, and we've had experience with that earlier this year. But what's more remarkable is how the church, in the midst of fierce persecution, continued to insist on gathering together corporately for worship with other people. And they had these elaborate constructions of how they would build pulpits out of wire and sheets that could be rapidly constructed and deconstructed, so that during the normal course of the week it would look nothing more than like nothing more than a pile of laundry or something like that. But on Sunday, it became a pulpit. And they would preach, and they would meet together, and they would celebrate the Lord's Supper just like we did this past Sunday. Remarkable, the people of God and the lengths that they went to worship God together as a church. And it puts into perspective the relative inconveniences that we might have to endure as we come together and worship on Sundays in this building. You know, whether it's wearing a mask for 45 minutes or being a little bit chilly because we're leaving the windows open to get good ventilation through. 45 minutes of relative inconvenience in comparison to what the French Huguenots had to endure, the very danger of their lives by meeting to worship together. But there's another aspect to that demonstrates God's work to the church and in the church, and that's all those people that fled France. And they weren't cowards, but they were fleeing so that they would be able to worship God in the way that they believed God called them to worship him. And one might think that this was an example of God's power not working on behalf of his people. because he didn't strengthen them to be able to worship there in France. He forced them to leave and to go into other countries in Europe. Bryan Chapell, who is a former seminary professor and president and pastor, and is now the stated clerk for the denomination that we're a part of, the Presbyterian Church in America. He wrote a book, and he was commenting on this passage, and he talks about how the French Huguenots had a profound impact throughout the centuries, not just in France, but in the places where they went after they were forced to leave France. He said that he was traveling once on a tour where he was speaking to churches in Eastern Europe, in some of the hardest places of communist Eastern Europe, where the church had been persecuted for years and years. And as he talked to some of these pastors and some of these church leaders in these places, he began to learn that many of them were descended from the French Huguenots. They had learned through centuries of experience what it meant to be a church that survived and even thrived underground and under persecution. These were the people that, not in opposition to God's plan, but in fulfillment of God's plan, were sent into places where their influence would be necessary centuries later. It's an example, Chapell says, of the work that God does even when we don't know he's working. The work of God's power on behalf of his church, even when it doesn't seem like it. This is how he summarizes it. He says, "In the time since the Huguenots' persecution, kings and kingdoms have come and gone. Governments and philosophies have risen and fallen. Dictators and oppressors have ruled and faded. But through it all, the Church of Jesus Christ, carrying the message of his eternal love and final rule, has endured. The gates of hell have not prevailed against it, and they shall not. Christ shall have dominion, and he will use his church to bring his rule to the hearts of his people throughout the world." He has, he is, and he will. That's how God works on our behalf, using his immeasurably great power. And that's the story that was left on the desk.